Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with my fellow editor, Marc LiVecche, with another installment of our Marxism conversation. This will be our last, in which Marc LiVecche is broadcasting from Oxford, England. He will be returning to America appropriately on Bastille Day next week. So, Mark, we look forward to your return, and I wanted to ask you your thoughts about two particular articles this week in Providence, the first of which was Joshua Mitchell's critique or response to a proclamation by several Ivy League seminary presidents and two Methodist seminary presidents demanding moral leadership from the presidency. The second of which is Dan Strand's response or analysis of Catholic integralism. So let's start with Josh Mitchell's piece in which he starts off by saying basically it's incorrect to expect moral leadership from the presidency or from politics. The moral leadership should come from the churches and from the seminaries, and rather it's the presidency and politics that should be mediating, but not providing a spiritual lodestar. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I referred earlier to it as his gloomy analysis. I think his gloomy analysis is spot on. First of all, it's a bit rich that I think there were 6 seminary presidents or seminary leaders who were lamenting.
Let's name them. So it's Yale, Union, Princeton, Duke, Candler, and Vanderbilt.
Nicely done. Very good. You win. It's a bit rich for those folks to be lamenting the lack of moral leadership in the United States. The analogy that I would use is when the helmsman abdicates the wheel, he shouldn't raise a stink when the ship goes adrift. So they're looking in the wrong places. If anything, outside of the family and outside of the local congregation, should be in the business of building moral leaders. It ought to be our nation's seminaries. So they get the critique correct, but instead of pointing out where they need to be pointing back at themselves. One also wonders what kind of moral leader they would be content with in the political sphere. One suspects that they won't be happy with any kind of a moral leader except one that is made in their own image. And that's an ongoing frustration with a lot of the conversations swirling around the crises of the day. People aren't talking to each other, they're talking past each other. People aren't having conversations, they're screaming. There doesn't seem to be a real hunger for dialogue. So I'm not sure that they would embrace a moral leader from the presidency if indeed they actually had one. Josh lamented the setting aside of Niebuhr in his own day when he was going through the University of Chicago. And both Dan Strand, who we'll talk about in a moment, myself, went through the University of Chicago together, probably a few years after Josh did. But we saw the same thing. Niebuhr was not taken as seriously as he ought to be. Even our own PhD supervisor, Jean Beth Gelstein, she was not taken as seriously as she ought to be because she believed in those quaint old ideas like human sinfulness. And not a lot of people gave her a place at the table. She forced one. She set herself down. But there is a crisis that is not going to be resolved by simply having a moral leader in the White House or in any political sphere. We have to be involved in the business ourselves. So
Josh Mitchell labels the previous 2 presidents as quote unquote moral leaders. He found them to be polarizing and agents, I suppose, in ongoing culture wars. He labels the current president as not a moral leader, but a transactionalist. And yet America seems about as polarized as it's ever been under this transactionalist. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Again, I don't think we're going to like the moral leader that we have unless that moral leader thinks like us, looks like us, acts like us, celebrates the things that we celebrate. I was shocked. I was living in Slovakia at the time, and I was shocked at the divisive that the W administration, Bush the Younger's administration, brought to America. I didn't think that he warranted it, but the divisiveness was developed. And then Obama comes along, and you see it arguably exacerbated. So yeah, I mean, the moral leadership from the White House that we've had, I think Josh is right. It's served to divide, and again, I think mainly because people aren't interested in having real conversations. Trump's transactionalism seems to open a wound. People know that there is a need for a moral exemplar, somebody that is worthy of being emulated. Human beings are hopelessly prone to model our behavior after those around us. Josh Mitchell a few weeks ago had an article that gestured toward Rene Girard and the whole idea of looking for moral exemplars. And I think nowadays, with the lack of public agreement on what is worth emulating, we follow bad men, and there's a hollowness that creates. People are hungry for real morality. I think you see it even in the nonsense you see in the streets. If I was to give it a positive read, all these people who are tearing down statues and griping about the police, there are real legitimate concerns. We all know that. But the positive spin I would give it is that there is a hunger because people recognize that they are malnourished. They're looking for something, and it has to be a moral something because we know what we have is insufficient. Josh Mitchell points to this, the modern poison of deconstruction, where there's this great leveling out. There is no need for good news because there is no bad news. Human sinfulness is not a real thing, and that's insufficient. People know that there is a right, and people know that there is a wrong, and they might be, terrified as hell talking about that or identifying it in themselves, but it's there. And so people are looking for expiation, and now we're looking for it maybe in the highest office in the land, and it's the wrong place to look.
Not finding it in these seminaries, which are themselves agents of deconstruction, although perhaps Princeton and Duke are not quite where Union or Vanderbilt might be, but they all have partaken from that cup, haven't they?
They have. I think so. I think they've given us the Church of Christ without Christ. It's a bit of a shame. Flannery O'Connor would have recognized that she wouldn't have endorsed it.
Well, speaking of the Church of Christ, let's move on to integralism, of which Dan Strand offers his analysis and critique. But integralism, of course, is this perspective that's gained some oxygen in the last few years from some American Catholic thinkers advocating that perhaps the ideal polity or society is one in which, once again, quote unquote, the church is central and paramount, and what we would regard as Anglo-American liberalism should be set aside as a failure. So what did you think of Dan's analysis?
I loved it because he has articulated what I believe. So hopefully I would have loved it anyway, just because it was self-sufficiently erudite and all of that. But yeah, I think Dan has finally put his finger on what I think is the best way to regard this whole conversation, let's call it, between, say, the Amaris on the one side and the Frenches on the other. Dan supports liberalism. Dan is a liberal, I think, but he recognizes the integralist critique of liberalism as having some merit. Dan describes liberalism as democracy and the rule of law, and the location of individual rights and freedom. One could be forgiven. We hear Nancy Pelosi the other day say, in response to whether or not people should be tearing down the statues or whether or not it should be something that's done, following public deliberation and consensus building, and she sort of shrugs it off and says, "Oh, people will do what they want to do." And you could be forgiven for thinking that the rule of law is increasingly absent from American public life. He talks about David French, and David French's defense of liberalism is largely rooted in the notion that, well, it works. And okay, the integralist might say it works until it doesn't work. Liberal politics functions when everybody is playing by the same rules. But if I think that my permission to swing my fist ends where your nose begins, that's well and good. But if I'm in a room full of other people who believe that it's a full contact MMA fight, then it's not going to go well with me. Everybody has to agree on the rules of liberalism for liberalism to work. And I think there is increasing disagreement. And because of that, I think the integralist critique that something else needs to replace it is understandable. There's a coherence, I think, in their critique. Like Dan, I don't imagine that their solution is the proper one, especially because, as French has said over and over, the integralist critique might work if you're the one wielding the levers of power, but as soon as the other team is wielding the levels of power, then things change. So liberalism is the hedge against all of that, and that's probably right. But people need to be brought into some sort of common consensus as to what public life is supposed to look like. Because I have a feeling that I might be trying to play baseball and I am getting tackled, and that makes playing baseball incredibly difficult. So I like it. I think there's a good balance. There's a good recognition. Dan calls us to a conversation. That conversation has to happen. My guess is that the best of liberalism can be a cure for the worst of liberalism. But too often liberalism's liberty has become license, and license begins to erode the whole basis for liberalism in the first place. So,
as we've discussed on previous occasions, integralism seems to have a lot of appeal for a lot of, or a number of very smart, young, very traditionalist Catholics. And there are still others who aren't necessarily integralists, and yet they share the same critique of liberalism, Patrick Deneen and Rod Dreher being most prominent. I suppose Sohrab Ahmari has never self-identified as an integralist, but certainly an outspoken critic of liberalism. It seems to be almost an entirely Catholic debate. Where are thoughtful young Protestants here? Is there any version of integralism for them, or are they defending liberalism, or are they just basically abstaining from the whole conversation?
It's a good question. I would like your thoughts on that. Yeah, I mean, we're probably, Protestants are probably dispositionally liberal, I suppose. Historically, not always. There's very often a lot of my Protestant friends who argue against integralism. There's a certain somewhat non-malignant anti-Catholicism about them. So I think we've got some sort of natural hesitancies towards something like integralism, especially because it seems grounded in so much that is Catholic. But I don't know. Maybe we're just, maybe the Protestant poison is we're just hopelessly optimistic that, we can always be reforming, and even something like liberalism can reform itself, which historically it probably always has. But that's a hope bordering on optimism, and
satanic optimism, as Peter Hitchens would say.
Optimism is creeping back in. Precisely that. What do you think?
I keep waiting for, as we've discussed again before, I keep waiting for some form of Christian Reconstructionism to make a revival. Right. It was somewhat of a thing back in the 1980s and died off as its primary thinkers themselves died off. But I haven't heard any echoes of it yet among young Protestant and evangelical thinkers. Have you?
No, probably not. I'm growing curious as to whether or not a part of the problem is that we, and I mean, when I say we, I mean a very large collective we, as in conservatives or Protestant Christians. I think we're spending a lot of time formulating really good arguments, and that's really important. We have to do that. Providence as a journal, I think, is in the business of formulating good arguments. But if I'm right that there is increasingly a lack of interest in dialogue, then arguments are not going to resolve anything. People are simply going to dig in their heels and not be open to persuasion. And if that's the case, then I think one of the routes toward Reconstruction is to knock the props out from under the deconstructionists, to identify the hungers that people have by maybe asking really pointed questions instead of making really solid arguments, which seem to be largely falling on deaf ears. Talking to some of the, I said earlier, talking to some of my friends at the English L'Abri, and L'Abri has always been really good at starting conversations by asking really good questions based on having spent a lot of time listening to what people are saying they believe. And then you ask good questions that leave your fellow conversationalists recognizing their own lack. So I think the arguments are important, but I think we need to begin helping people ask themselves questions to get to the hungers that they have. I think everybody's asking the religious questions. Who am I? Where did we come from? We look around, we recognize that something is wrong. We want to know, what went wrong, how, who's going to fix it. So yes, I think there can be a reconstruction, but I think a lot of us are going about it not the wrong way, but a way that is maybe not as not as important for the times. I'm still building my thoughts on this, but I think we need to be asking some questions that strip away the lies that people have allowed themselves to believe. And I think when we attack them full frontal, they put up a shield and they simply protect themselves rather than be open to dialogue. So look for a forthcoming article in the halls of Providence as I try to put my thoughts together on a way to reconstruct.
I will look forward to it. And one final question for you, Mark, is a Christian realist, as we at Providence self-identify as, are we by definition liberals? And integralism would be intrinsically at odds with Christian realism, would it not?
Yes, and I say that like yes, because there's yes, I think undoubtedly, and that's the heavy emphasis on the realist part. I think an argument can be made that in Thomas Aquinas, he says, look, there's absolutely nothing wrong with monarchy. And, having spent 2 years in England, I haven't quite become a monarchist, but I see the value, I see the potential beauty. I'm not afraid of hierarchy. I've never been. But the realist in me says, it doesn't work. We have to be, democracy, freedom, balance of powers, the kind of pluralism that only a liberal democracy seems, really able to furnish. But if it's not, the other way of saying it, though, is that my hesitancy comes from this. If liberalism is not rooted ultimately in a Hebraic tradition, then liberalism is just going to be license. And I think in America, we are increasingly abandoning our Hebraic roots. And when we do that, I'm not really sure if I think liberalism can flourish. That's my fear. That's, it works until it doesn't work. And I think it works because it's still benefiting from its Christian roots.
Liberty over license. Marc LiVecche, thank you for another insightful Marxism conversation. We look forward to seeing you back in the US of A next week.
Next week. Absolutely. Take care, Mark.
Bye-bye.